Okay, so as we did yesterday evening, we're pleased to have our 4 volunteers from each of the breakout groups to give a little bit of insight on the conversations that they've had today. Obviously, if there was stuff from yesterday you wanted to add, that's fine as well. But we're going to go in reverse order from yesterday. So we'll start with the group on the future of place-based innovation. Please.
All right, my group did not follow instructions and they did not pick a new person, so you're stuck with me again. And I'm not going to be quite as brief as yesterday because we were a little broader in our scope today. But we started out, or we had a theme throughout of barriers, and we talked quite a bit about what are some of the barriers to creating these innovation ecosystems and to seeing success in this area. Trust was brought up as a significant barrier, and how do you build the bonds of trust that you need across the different pieces of your innovation ecosystem. We had a really interesting conversation acknowledging that in this new geography of innovation, that we may not always be able to successfully bring innovation to all of the communities, that at a certain point, especially when we're looking at some of these very small, very rural communities, there just may not be the density there to really realistically jumpstart innovation in those communities. So how do we think about what happens when we can't bring innovation to a community, but we may need to think about bringing some of those people to where we're able to create those innovation ecosystems. We talked about technology as both a barrier and an opportunity. We spent a lot of time talking about broadband and internet and the cost and both, is it accessible and available at all? And if it is it at a price point that can be used by our innovators? And there is definitely space to improve across some of these communities. We also talked a lot about the opportunities for telehealth and the decentralization of innovation to be facilitated by technology. Access to capital for our individual innovators was also recognized as a barrier. You may have someone who $20,000 in their pocket is going to be the difference between being able to start up a business and not being able to do it, but that our systems are not currently well structured to make those choices and to get those dollars directly to the innovators. And that if you don't have the access to venture capital and some of those big systems, how do you fill in those gaps? Another significant barrier that we talked about, healthcare, childcare, other various social supports. You know, for some of these folks who may want to be innovators, they're going to keep working at Walmart because they have healthcare there. And if they can't get access to healthcare somewhere else, they're not going to have that opportunity to innovate. Similarly, childcare can be an issue. And then housing came up as another issue that for some of our communities, we're going to have to start being really innovative when we think about how we create housing if we want to bring in people to come be innovators. So that was kind of all the negative. We had quite a few barriers, but we do have some positives as well. We talked about brain drain, and what we really started to talk about was the idea of a path back. You know, you don't necessarily mind if some of your students and your thinkers, they leave, but you want to create a path back for them to come back to their region. And we talked about doing it in 2 ways. Philosophically, you create a welcoming community, a community that is open, welcoming, equitable, all of those things. But then you also do some of the concrete things to attack some of the barriers we talked about. So what can we do to provide healthcare and other services? What can we do to use technology to attract people to these new innovation ecosystems? We talked about creating centers of gravity, and that could be anchors like the national labs, like universities. It could be the private sector. Government is going to have a role, and we're going to have to tap into local social networks to create these centers of gravity that will pull in the innovation we're looking for. And finally, we talked about what is the toolkit that we're going to use to create these centers of innovation. And some of the tools that came up, some of them were local. We talked about state lands and whether there are better opportunities to use state lands. We talked about looking at other models, looking really far afield. Apparently, there are excellent parallels between Mongolia and Western Australia for a lot of what's going on here in the state of Wyoming. And so looking for those best practices wherever you can find them, creating a story around your anchor, using technology as an opportunity, as I already mentioned, and then coming up with the better ways to access capital and all those social safety nets we needed. Finally, we did talk a little bit about people who weren't at the table with us today, that we didn't have state legislators here, that we didn't have trustees of the university. The Minerals Committee was mentioned specifically. Again, not necessarily as a barrier, but for future opportunities, trying to make sure you have all of the people at the table who can start to pull those levers that you need for innovation. And then finally, we wanted to challenge everyone in the room today and challenge the commission to really work to go back and look for ways to pull the big levers at the federal level, but then figure out what the specific ask can be at the regional and state level, and make sure we're making those recommendations as well, and not just focusing at the federal level. So we really want a top-down, bottom-up complementary effort, and we think that's where we need to focus to get these innovation ecosystems going.
Fantastic. Anybody from the place-based innovation group that wanted to add anything? Okay, let's go to the future of work in the workforce.
Thank you. I'm Laura Baker, and we wrote ours down, but I still need my reading glasses. So sorry. Okay. So overall, we talked about the culture of learning and keeping up with automation over time, and how important it is to constantly retool and create that culture of learning nationwide. And one of the things, the ideas that came up that everybody in the group absolutely loved was creating a 529 account for learning that would go with you no matter what employer you were with. And it would be maybe federally tax deductible, but something like that would be amazing. It would incentivize this workforce to engage in lifelong learning, and that would start to create a new culture. We also talked about better engagement between industry and training resources with agreed upon outcomes. So whether that training comes from higher ed or a workforce services or certification stacking, that was the discussion. We need to expand the properly trained workforce and the quantity, and immigration policies were talked about there, and we talked quite a bit about innovation with immigration and diversity. And we also acknowledged that we were a group of primarily white men and women in that group, and the diversity just wasn't there to actually really address diversity in itself. We talked about skills translation of shrinking industries. And so, for instance, we talked about mining to aerospace. A lot of them, they had skills in the rare earth minerals. Industry to industry collaboration on skills transition. So again, so you would take aerospace and extraction, and they have some commonalities, and you would try to translate those skills. Finally, we talked about new models of workforce development to engage the 80%, the 18%, and the 2%. We didn't get into that as much as we wanted to because we ran out of time, but that is definitely something that I'm sure everybody was talking about because that was an amazing keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additions? Oh, yep, no, please. Anyone from that breakout group that wanted to add anything? Terrific. Let's go to breakout number 2, the future of technology, developing and deploying disruptive technologies at scale.
Thanks, Bill. Hello, everyone. I'm Greg Morin from Argonne National Laboratory. So we broke into 3 subgroups and then had a robust discussion around the ideas of the 3 groups, and there was a lot of convergence. And we came up with 4 recommendations that I'll go through. All right, so the first one is creation of a national innovation director role. And the analog we put forth is similar to the director of national intelligence, right? So at one point, we've got intelligence work through many federal agencies, and they have been brought together under the DNI, and that's been a sort of a relatively successful activity. We saw the example yesterday of the TIP effort in NSF, and you could look at a handful of agencies, just looking at the DOE and NIH, and of course NSF, and on, the DOD and Commerce, and there's so much innovation and potential, and bringing all of those agencies together at some level to work on innovation is a recommendation. We talked about implementation of the Government Performance and Results Act, right? So how do you hold government agencies accountable for executing on what they say they're going to do. So really a focus on strategy and outcomes and a push for accountability. We talked about the importance of working with NIST and engaging on standards development. That's a contact sport. That's nothing you do internal to this country. It's engaging throughout the, internationally, and ensuring that, we are part of standards, and standards are developed that can be used throughout the world. Converging on national priorities, or convening on national priorities. So the example of Operation Warp Speed is the classic example now of government agencies coming together with labs and universities and many different agencies with Operation Warp Speed. So that was, sort of an opportunity for a national innovation director role to convene on particular topics, right? People love to bring up the moonshot role. What are those projects? We tend to have lists of technologies in different sectors, and it's too much, right? And when an opportunity comes up, a crisis that drives an opportunity to move technology forward, this country, can do amazing things. And managing favorable IP terms. So there's a good discussion on how will you go to different national labs, or you go to universities and you're a venture investor, your IP terms are, sort of at the whim of whatever, general counsel you're working with, right? I mean, it's all over the map, and getting some consistency across federal agency R&D IP development would be helpful for our investors. Okay, so that was number one. So number two is sort of increasing the funding of innovation to a greater percent of GDP. In our materials, there's a great graph that shows R&D investment and how China is really moving closer to the US. And the notion that, not the notion, but the fact that leading in innovation is hard, right? It's hard to come up with new ideas. It's hard to grow new ideas, and second mover advantage is a real thing, right? And the closer China gets to us, and they have been since 2010, the bend on their curve is they're creeping up. They're going to be able to, they are in many different technology areas, benefiting from second mover advantage to creating new markets. That was number two. Number three is the intentional funding of translational research, right? So I know in the National Lab Complex, most of the labs sort of top out at TRL4 work. We have some applied work, say with INL and NREL, maybe a little higher, but the actual funding through the TIP program and at the national labs to higher TRL level research that will reduce risk for our investors, right? So Steve Savanovich yesterday spoke to, he loves to invest in the Valley of Death area companies, but there's a ton of risk there, and if we can reduce that risk some, we could actually perform better in that space. And this is really a collaboration also between labs, universities, and industry, right? And this is, Deborah pushes this constantly with the council. And so this would be a venue for that. And then also, we talked about looking for, inclusive ecosystems, sort of beyond the S&T focus here. So that would be something to, it's not all just about S&T. And then our fourth recommendation was focused on supply chain. There was an interesting idea of creation of a national marketplace for supply chain. So suppose you wanted to start a car company and you wanted to build all the parts in the US, right? And you don't know how to do that. So could there be a marketplace where people could go saying, well, I need this and I don't know where to get it in the US, or on the other side, on the supply side, I can do this. Are there any customers? So, so the identification of gaps and in the supply chain internal to this country, and creation of incentives for new entrants into development of supply chains for new, for different marketplaces. So those are our four things.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Yep. Sorry. don't mean not to encourage the applause. It's not like graduation where you have to wait till the end, right? Anybody else from that breakout session that wanted to add anything?
A phenomenal use of the Department of Defense's the power of the Departments of Defense ability to acquire things. What's often overlooked is the role of the FBI and other law enforcement organizations that were very aggressively interdicting criminal activities. There were many Chinese actors that were very persistently pursuing access to IP that was being developed under Operation Warp Speed. So there's a security element to safeguarding things that we need to protect that was part of that should be in the model.
Great, thank you for that addition. Okay, our final group is the future of sustainability.
Hello, my name is Glenn Pauley. I'm from USDA Rural Development, and we talked about various policies as far as what could support the increase in innovation in the energy section. One of the things that we acknowledge right off the bat is that policy can both stifle and spur innovation. And one of the most important things there is that uncertainty makes it very difficult, or it holds back investment in these areas. We talked a little bit about having policy be more outcome-based. It seems like a lot of the federal policy in energy is to support various industries, be it wind or solar or hydrogen, but could you actually come out of what are the intended outcomes as far as reducing carbon or efficiency or transition? And so that would both level the playing field and also would reduce the government's role as far as picking losers and winners. We talked a lot, and it was mentioned here earlier, is that this transitions has a lot of implications for policy at the state level. We talked about the lack of housing in Wyoming, which is a statewide issue now, lack of healthcare and infrastructure. So do we really have the ability in Wyoming, even though there's a lot of potential, a lot of desire to handle new industry coming to Wyoming? So that's something that probably both at the federal and at the state level that we need to assist in this type of growth. Time frame came up as a big issue for this conversion. And there are two real areas that we talked about this. One, as far as the time frame for venture capital. And we were reminded that for a lot of venture capital, their planning horizon is 3 years. And that's not the same planning horizon that we are dealing in with this transition. A lot of what we also talked about as far as the regulatory environment is that the current regulations that we have in place will probably not allow the expansion or the innovation that what we need. So the regulatory environment really needs to be revisited. We talk a little bit about the Department of Energy. It was felt that the Department of Energy is really not organized to support this innovation or clean energy. It is largely based around the various fuels that we currently use. And we talked a little bit about current events. And right now, the need in the country to increase oil and gas production. That is something that a lot of the oil and gas companies are actually now looking more to be in the carbon field. They have a lack of willingness to invest just because they see the future. And so there seems to be a really big disconnect between some of the messages that's been sent by Washington and what they're being asked to do today.
Terrific, thank you. Any, yeah. Everyone gets the applause. Any additional comments from the energy group? Hearing none,